Convicted kidnapper Theodore Bundy appeared before the state parole board today to ask that a parole date be set, but the parole board continued the parole hearing pending the outcome.
Horror movies and true crime are a Venn diagram, whether that's for better or for worse, with a lot of media sitting at the center. And I can't blame people for being curious. Like, the ultimate question is, why do people do totally barbaric things? And I feel like we make films about it to try and answer that question. I think we believe that if we make films about it, the answer will be brought to light somehow, but it never really is. Personally, I don't like how much true crime intersects with horror because although it deals with dark subjects and imagery, it is not based on real life. And I think a true crime movie in the wrong hands is like disrespectful at best and disgusting at worst. Like, can you actually imagine your dad traps you in the basement for like your entire life and they make a Lifetime movie about it with you being portrayed by an American actress and you're not American? That is totally disrespectful to me, and it looks like this. Like, it just looks so unserious. And I do think that most true crime horror movies or like true crime movies are wildly unethical because they don't do anything other than dilute the experiences of real people. And that is my main problem with it, because why are you dredging up this horrific thing if you're not going to be adding anything substantial to it? But it is possible to reference real life in a way that adds something meaningful and makes this dredging up of horrible things worth it. The Poughkeepsie tapes, for example, really starting off with a controversial one, but it does reference a lot of real life true crime, and it uses like these realistic aspects to really multiply the horrifying effect of the film. Although it isn't like based on real people and like no one is acting as someone else, it does really do a realistic job at portraying serial killers. But it does effectively show how trauma, as severe as like being kidnapped or tortured, can break your brain in a way that destroys fundamental parts of yourself. And that is the part that isn't really talked about a lot. I also think it does something interesting by showing how society handles unimaginable darkness by sanitizing it and putting it into boxes on the news to like make people feel better about it. And The Sacrament is another film inspired by a real life tragedy, Jonestown, but it does have its own unique story. It deals with the mechanics of cults and the pitfalls of modern journalism in a way that I think is valuable. And all of the deaths in The Sacrament magnify like the dangers of manipulation and cult tactics. And Zodiac is based on a real crime and real people, but it centers its focus so religiously on real life and real documents that it is honoring the darkness of what was happening. And it doesn't dilute anything. It's like very much real and you very much feel the weight of it. But that's more of a personal opinion. There's also an episode of Atlanta that depicts a true crime about the Hart family murders. But its primary goal, like as a piece of media, is to first of all shed light on something that not a lot of people know about, but also to show the very specific and unique Black perspective. That is adding something valuable. It's uprooting a core message in a way that isn't diluting or covering up someone else's suffering. But overall, I think those examples are actually like picked out of a bunch of very, very disrespectful ones. I think overall the bad just outweighs the good, but that is honestly true for most of horror because of the way that the genre is. It's like very go big or go home, hit or miss, and you're going to end up with a lot of bad movies. So I just think it isn't really a good idea to portray real life crimes, honestly. But overall, I think that the bad outweighs the good. And that is because it is just too hard to execute properly. Because when you have nothing to add, you're just replaying a crime for no reason, or for shock value, or for people to watch if they're curious about someone else's worst moments of their life. For example, in the Jeffrey biopic by Ryan Murphy, he made Jeffrey the main character in a really like problematic way, I think. And Jeffrey's actual just face was like all over LA in like as he's like a horror movie villain. Like it was not realistic at all, and it was based on a real person. So when you put Jeffrey in the context of like the horror movie villain, you are making all of his victims basically plot devices. Not to mention a lot of the victims' families did not know about it, and they were like, their lives were dramatized in a way that was not adding anything and just portraying their trauma for no reason. But to put it plainly, I think you need a damn good reason. And this usually isn't an issue because horror exists on its own as like an entirely separate piece of art or commentary or just a fun time. So this isn't usually a concern. It's completely and wholly separate from the worst parts of someone's life. But there is one true crime film that I think works on a different level than any other one in its genre could, and that is because of who it is about. It extends in a very meta way to the viewer and kind of digs into your brain without you noticing. There is only one single gore image shown in the film, and it is a Polaroid of a headless torso. So today we're talking about Ted Bundy, but specifically the biopic made about him called Extremely Wicked, Shockingly Evil and Vile. And to talk about this movie properly, I need to do a quick recap on who Ted Bundy is because although he's like the most prolific serial killer ever, arguably of all time, he was doing things in the late 60s. That's 60 years ago. And in a really dark way, I think the number and magnitude of his crimes gets lost on people because of how many there were. I think after maybe 5 murders, people start to like not be able to comprehend it. Kind of the way that you can't comprehend $1 million. You can't visualize it, like it's too much to understand. And not because people aren't empathetic or they don't care, it's just, it's not normal. So to talk about this movie, I do need to do a basic overview of his crimes and like a very small snippet of his life. After you hear this, if you don't know about it, you will know why there is so much media about Ted Bundy. It's literally like, there are so many movies, so many books. Everyone and their mom wrote a book. It's just like massive cultural moment in America. So I don't think his childhood is important here because this isn't really a video about Ted Bundy, but more about everybody else. But you should know that he did find a birth certificate that said he was illegitimate, and that some people think was the catalyst for everything that he did later, like feeling not good enough. And he was most likely abused by his grandfather verbally or physically. His grandfather was the type to like swing cats by their tails. And as a child, Ted was showing signs of psychopathy, such as, yes, hurting animals, but like crazy other shit like that is totally insane. When he was 3 years old, he surrounded one of his family members with knives, and then like she was sleeping, and then she woke up and he was just staring at her with all these knives around her. He once hanged a stray cat from his clothesline in the backyard and set it on fire, which is so horrible. He also built makeshift traps like the ones from the Vietnam War, with the spikes in the ground and like the leaves on top for neighborhood kids to fall into in the woods. And this injured at least one girl. There was also a heavily debated event that happened when he was around 14. I personally believe that he did this, like based on the evidence, but 8-year-old Anne Marie Burr vanished from her Tacoma home right next to Ted Bundy, and he was on her paper route. So like he was a paper boy and drove by her house a lot on his bike. There was a tennis shoe found by the bench that was used to get into the house, and it was a youth shoe. And police thought it was either a youth or a teenager based on the shoe size. And this girl's father was certain that it was Ted because he saw Ted around this construction site like the morning of her disappearance. So not a good start. Childhood, not a good start. And then during his life, he was basically a career criminal. He burglarized everybody. And Liz, his girlfriend, we're going to get into that, but Liz basically said everything of substance that he had stolen. He was an aggressor, constantly being abusive to people, but he was holding very normal jobs and a very normal reputation on the outside. He was ramping up to be an agent of chaos and destruction while holding down jobs and being normal. And most people did not notice his emptiness. They did not notice it. He was never really seen as strange except by very close people to him. In 1974, he attacked 18-year-old Karen Sparks in her basement apartment and bludgeoned her with a metal rod from her bed frame and then SA'd her with that same rod, rupturing her bladder. Sparks was unconscious in the hospital for 10 days, but she did survive, but she was left with permanent brain damage and loss to her vision and hearing. About a month later, he basically did the same thing to another girl, breaking into her basement apartment. It was 21-year-old Linda Ann Healy, and he kidnapped her, SA'd her, drove her to a remote location, and dumped her body. This is kind of his MO. So during this first half of 1974, college girls were disappearing at a rate of 1 per month. During this time, he also abducted Donna Gail Manson, and he said that he burned her skull in his girlfriend's fireplace in a fit of paranoia and cleanliness. On April 17th that year, Susan Elaine Rancourt disappeared. And on May 6th that year, 20-year-old Roberta Kathleen Sparks disappeared along with 22-year-old Brenda Carol Ball on June 1st. And yes, these are all confirmed murders by Ted, either by confession or by evidence. On June 11th, 18-year-old Georgia Hawkins disappeared. He lured her to his car and spent the night with her body after hitting her with a crowbar. On July 14th, he really infamously abducted 2 women in plain daylight in a huge community event at Lake Sammamish Park. This was 23-year-old Janice Ann Ott and 19-year-old Denise Marie Nashland. Really horrifyingly, they were together. So after this spree, he went to law school in Colorado and he studied his first-year curriculum a second time. I don't know if he's fucking stupid or he's too busy killing people, whatever. He's so stupid. He was devastated to find that the students had, quote, some more intellectual capacity than he had. He found the classes completely incomprehensible. Because of this alone, I think it just proves how much of an act this was. I'm not going to really get into the trials in this video because that is a 5-hour video in itself, but he was putting on this act like he was this super smart student lawyer. He was doing all this research. It was like he had 1 million books in his cell and he was constantly trying to go to the library and do research for hours and hours. I don't think he was smart enough to be actually doing anything. I think this was a facade. He fired his counsel and was his own lawyer, and that's part of the reason why he was sentenced to death, because he was an awful lawyer to himself. But he put on this aura that he was a really good lawyer and people just believed him. So after he moved to Colorado, of course, a new string of disappearances was happening. On September 7th, he abducted a hitchhiker that is still unknown. He then returned the next day to photograph and dismember her corpse. Horrible. Then on October 2nd, he abducted 16-year-old Nancy Wilcox and drove back to his apartment where he kept her for 24 hours. On October 18th, 17-year-old Melissa Ann Smith disappeared. She was found about 9 days later. Postmortem examination said that she was alive for up to 7 days. On October 31st, 17-year-old Laura Ann Amy disappeared. Bundy described his postmortem rituals with these two. He did makeup on them and did their hair. Horrible. On October 8th, Deborah Jean Kent disappeared. He said that she was alive during quote-unquote half of it. And on January 12th, 1975, it's only the next year, this is all in the span of 2 years, 23-year-old Karen Eileen Campbell literally disappeared while walking from the elevator to her room at a hotel that was well lit in public. On March 15th, 26-year-old Julie Lyle was abducted and he drove 6 hours after the fact, weeks later, to visit her remains. On April 16th, Denise Lynn Oliverson was abducted and dumped in the Colorado River. On May 6th, 12-year-old Lynette Dawn Culver was kidnapped. And on June 28th, 15-year-old Susan Curtis vanished, and this was his last tape-confessed murder. Some think that he should have been kept alive for longer to confess to more. And I don't know what I think about that, but he was just kind of getting started on confessing. Like, he didn't confess until the very, very, very last minute. So Bundy actually escaped prison twice. The first time he jumped out of a window and he was caught. And the second time he lost 30 pounds and tunneled his way out. And he actually fled to Florida after this second escape. Just 1 week after he arrived in Tallahassee, he was already doing like chaos. He entered a sorority house at FSU and bludgeoned 21-year-old Margaret Elizabeth Bowman with a piece of firewood. He then entered the bedroom of 20-year-old Lisa Janet Levy, brutally attacked her. And then in the adjoining bedroom, he attacked 21-year-old Kathy Kleiner and 21-year-old Karen Chandler, and they both survived. But these 4 attacks happened in the span of 15 minutes. So he's on a total rampage. Right after leaving that house, he went a few blocks down the street and attacked another woman in basement apartment, 21-year-old Cheryl Thomas, and she survived, but she had injuries that ended her career. On February 8th, he still evaded capture, and he drives in a stolen van all the way to Jacksonville. He abducted 12-year-old Kimberly Diane Leach. These are just some of his victims. His victim count had already gone to 20 before people and cops in different jurisdictions realized they were all hunting the same person, but his total victim count is at least 35. He was, in general, a sadistic sociopath who took a lot of pleasure in other people's pain, and he would pose his victims to do really weird things like recreate magazine covers, and he was often revisiting burial sites to do more horrible things to them. One of the most heinous MOs, along with never being caught for the longest time. Some victims were found wearing articles of clothing or nail polish that they did not own. So all of Bundy's victims were females, middle-class backgrounds, and they mostly all had long brown hair parted in the middle. And it is important to know that in his early life, he was dumped by a woman who basically rejected him and made him feel inadequate, and he abducted people that looked like her. The actual film I'm discussing today was based on Liz's perspective, and Liz is Ted Bundy's long-term girlfriend who he was with for a lot of these crimes. Liz is played by Lily Collins, and Ted Bundy is played by Zac Efron. The movie was received pretty horribly. It has a 54% on Rotten Tomatoes, and there are a few complaints from audiences that are like the same over and over again. Chiefly that it sanitizes the reputation of Ted Bundy, and it is a film opposite to what the title suggests. The title being extremely wicked, shockingly evil, and vile. And that is a reference to what the judge called his crimes. And I think most of the complaints that I have an issue with are summed up in this one review that I read. And it basically said, I love the cast, but I think if you want to watch the movie, don't watch the Ted Bundy tapes first. Watch them after, then you will like the movie. I saw the tapes first and then the movie. So I kept scrutinizing the whole time or waiting to see scenes that didn't come up here. So I think this is a really fascinating thing that people want to see the overt violence. They want to see like the Ryan Murphy style recreations of violent acts. And people are almost disappointed in the lack of like depravity that this film shows. Another complaint was that it was painting Ted Bundy as like too attractive, and it was adding to toxic true crime culture. But Ted Bundy was attractive. That is the whole thing. That's why this movie exists. Like, he tricked a lot of people. He had the first nationally televised court case in the United States. And yes, there are plot points that are omitted, and it is not exactly totally accurate to real life. I think the shooting time for the movie was actually really short. Accuracy isn't the point of Extremely Wicked, Shockingly Evil, and Vile. It isn't Zodiac. And it isn't built on like depravity or showing you unimaginable darkness. It's tackling an entirely different thing than the violence itself. So films don't just pop out of nowhere. They're built in a very specific environment. And this film is assuming a lot about the viewer. It assumes that you know a little bit about arguably the biggest serial killer of all time, Ted Bundy, but it also assumes that you are not really paying attention to the newscast voiceovers of horrible crimes because you're distracted by Zac Efron driving in his car and being normal. It also assumes that Zac Efron will charm you into taking his side. And it is right to assume all of these things. It does this successfully. This isn't really a normal crime biopic because I don't think it is sensationalizing crimes at all. It doesn't even really show them. But instead, it is showing you through a movie how powerful Ted's coercion really was on America. How he was able to commit so much carnage and get away with it for so long is like a spectacle. So this isn't really a movie about Ted Bundy, but it is more about everybody else and our reaction and perception of him. So again, the film is loosely based on Liz's perspective and the account of her experiences being with Ted as his girlfriend. They did not include a lot of details from her book, details that were like the smoking gun, because I don't think that's the point of the film, to like convince you that he's guilty. It pretty much is trying to do the opposite. So between 1974 and 1975, when a lot of women were going missing, she was concerned that it was Ted. And she actually called the police and said, like, I think it might be Ted Bundy. She found some things in his car that were really suspicious, like a hatchet, a bag of surgical gloves, plaster of Paris, which is basically what he was using to make fake casts to lure women in. Also, their relationship was much more volatile and violent than represented in the film. He literally tried to murder her once, and he confessed this to her. When she was sleeping after a night of drinking, Bundy closed the fireplace and stuffed a towel under her bedroom door to keep from air coming out, and she just woke up coughing, not knowing that she almost got killed by him. What was included, though, is one of the really creepy moments where he's looking at her body with a flashlight underneath the covers, which he actually did. And what wasn't included was he would get very angry at her if she wanted to change her hairstyle, because again, he likes this specific type of hair, like long, parted in the middle. So they did work with Liz for this film. So I think what is omitted is entirely on purpose, because although Liz is extremely important to this movie and this is her story, she is basically a stand-in for the audience, or even like America in general. She is where we stand as a group in being suspicious of Ted Bundy. She is the audience acting inside of the film, and we don't really fully believe that he's guilty until she fully believes that he's guilty. And for a movie made about such an infamous person, it is able to trick you and charm and persuade you into believing that he may be an innocent man. And that fact alone is an unbelievable feat. And I don't think it is just because Zac Efron is charming. I don't think that's the reason. I think a lot of the like knee-jerk reactions to Extremely Wicked is like people not realizing how coercive and charming someone can be when they're not what you expect a serial killer to look like. And that is incredibly impressive to me that a film is able to do that. Because after the crimes that we just talked about, what powerful social forces have to be at play for you to ignore them? You're supposed to be charmed and lulled into disarm and disbelief. Because Ted Bundy was not a monster. He was a human being who was actually normal a lot of the time. And the most chilling part about it is the killer could be anybody in your life. So first of all, Zac Efron's performance is so entirely on point. He looks a lot like him, but also he displays outward charm and charisma, but there's like an emptiness underneath. And the reason that Ted Bundy and by nature Zac Efron in this movie portray this emptiness is because Ted was full of intense contradictions that showed that he had no real moral framework or personality base to really go off of. He had an unimaginable rage and disdain for all women, especially one woman, yet he ruined his life in the pursuit and obsession in harming them. He was like a staunch political Republican, but he also was like not ever respecting the law. He had 4 specific personalities. He had the organized serial killer, the neurotic, traumatized, scared individual, the self-serving, swashbuckling paranoid who was indifferent to reality, and the tearful man who did not want to die. Ultimately, this last version of him was the one that confessed to all of the crimes. But Extremely Wicked is showing you the 3rd version, the swashbuckling, indifferent to reality version of Ted that was very magnetic and powerful for people. In his time, the general consensus on Ted Bundy was that there's no way that he did these crimes. He's too nice. He's one of us. But why were so many people willing to believe him? To put it very plainly, he was a white guy in a 70s patriarchal society. He was a well-dressed chameleon. And even when he was convicted and sent to the electric chair, the judge was being nice to him. He was talking about how intelligent he is and how it's such a waste that he did this. And he even says, earnestly, take care of yourself. You would have been a great lawyer. There are also the women that were obsessed with him, and there are still people obsessed with him. And this level of respect and admiration for him is like almost too strange to be true. The way that he was able to launder his reputation would happen for nobody else. And he was treated in a way that he made a mockery of the justice system. So you can argue it is a combination of the halo effect, which is like the more attractive you are, you're more perceived positively and you have more positive characteristics. And there was this study done in 1975, and it basically said jurors were more likely to give a stiffer prison sentence to those defendants who most fit the crime stereotype. So, for example, they found that the attractive defendant received a lighter sentence for burglary, but a harsher sentence for con artist, and then vice versa. The idea of what we think a serial killer necrophile looks like is just not Ted Bundy. It might be now, but in the 70s it was not. And this is proven by the fact that Ted is so fucking famous, where like other killers with similar murder counts are not household names at all. Like Gary Ridgway killed 49 people and nobody knows who that is. He's not recognizable by name or, most importantly, face. Bundy is so magnetic to people because he did not appear as strange except for small fleeting moments where his mask slips. Professor Hervey M. Clerkley, he described the psychopath as a perfect mimic of a real person. They are able to mask or disguise the fundamental lack of internal personality structure, an internal chaos that results in repeatedly purposeful destructive behavior, often more self-destructive than destructive to others. Despite the seemingly sincere, intelligent, or even charming external presentation, internally the psychopathic person does not have the ability to experience genuine emotions. He also described in his research that he never saw a psychopath show real guilt or remorse. Now, if you can imagine somebody with no inner personality framework and no ability to feel guilt or remorse, free to act out any whim that they want, how destructive can that person be? And he also found that usually a psychopath will not accept blame and blame anything else for their actions. And Ted did this a lot. He blamed his childhood, the police, and then at the last minute, he was blaming like explicit magazines and movies. If that were true, then there would be a lot of Ted Bundys. But none of those are the reason that he did these things. So at the beginning of the film, there is a quote that says, "Few people have the imagination for reality." And my personal interpretation of this is like, you don't understand the gravity of this. And you really cannot unless you've lived it, which 99% of people have not. There is a scene near the end of the film where Ted is talking to Carol, who is another really important character. She basically became his girlfriend after Liz, and she believed him up until she didn't anymore. But he's warning her that she's going to hear very, very horrible things during this trial. And then she basically says something like, "It can't be worse than what I've heard on the news." Your first thought is, yes, it can be. Like, it can be so much worse. And I think that is a major theme of this film, because it would be so much worse that, like, putting them into a film, putting these actions into a film would be steamrolling it no matter how dark you went. That is just the fact of it. So this movie does not even try to do that, and it takes an entirely different approach. You're going into the first scene of the film thinking that there's something extremely wicked, shockingly evil, and vile about to happen. But it is shot like a romance movie. There is warm romantic lighting, American rock music, and like cozy settings, nostalgic 70s home and car, and like you're feeling comfortable. The movie makes you comfortable. And you've already put the first puzzle piece together for how you're going to rationalize Ted Bundy being innocent. And you're doing that without even really noticing. He's normal, he's kind to Liz, he's charming. And from this moment on, you're continually being proven that you're right in that assessment because he's behaving normally. He's behaving with confidence. And when you do get clips of violent scenes, like for a fraction of a second, or like actual news footage from the 70s, the film pairs it with very innocuous scenes of Ted driving or just doing something normal. So this violence is like secondary. Like, it's a secondary thing that is almost the undercurrent of the movie and not the main focus. You're focused on Zac Efron because he's very apple pie American, magnetic, and very suave. And that was, although simplifying it, a lot of Liz's experience along with the entirety of America. This film very deliberately distances Ted from the crimes, showing him as a victim of the system, a family man who got caught in a terrible thing. Now, in real life, Ted built a facade of personality that, whether on purpose or by accident, coincided with a lot of American deeply held traditional values, specifically what is seen as like admirable male traits. It seems incredibly stupid and disrespectful to describe Ted Bundy as like a cowboy type, but to the average person in the 70s and even now, he did look like one man against the system, someone victimized by politics or those with money, unequivocally innocent. And the scariest part is he was convicted by his own hubris alone. And had he had chosen not to represent himself, he might be a free man, which is totally insane to think about, thinking back to the crimes that I discussed. But that's how powerful and effective this mask was. But just like everything in Ted's life, this mask, this outward show contrasted with everything that he was really feeling. He had such a disdain for the working class, and he wanted his whole life to basically crawl out of the working class. He thought he was inadequate, but he used like public perception of him, of working class people, to be able to almost escape the charges, because all Ted knows how to do is to identify what he can use in people and then use that. But what's amazing about this film is it isn't just like leading you astray, because Zac isn't really behaving like nothing is wrong. He's doing a great job at masking, but he performs Ted as shallow. And there are scenes where you do see this mask slip, especially the courtroom scenes, but never all the way. And the film is so incredibly tense because you're waiting for it to slip, but you're caught between two really conflicting ideas. That the mask will never slip because it doesn't exist, or that it inevitably will because you know that Ted Bundy was a real person who really committed crimes and was guilty. And I think the idea that you could interact with the Ted Bundy type and not know it is a lot harder for people to accept than they really recognize. In the final scene of the film, when he is confessing to Liz for the first time, yes, I basically did it, the way that he does it is Liz asks what happened to this specific girl, and he writes the word hacksaw in the fog, in the prison phone things. Like he writes it with his finger. He doesn't even say it. That was the first confirmation the film genuinely gives you from Ted. and it is extremely chilling. But overall, I think this movie is a little bit of a hidden gem, not because it's unknown, but because everybody hates it. And I think that it's getting unfairly judged. I think its message is actually super important. It teaches an entirely new generation on the creepy, chilling, horrible feeling of being tricked by Ted Bundy and knowing that there are hundreds of him. And for a film to break the third wall like that, like be able to affect the viewer in such a meta way, I think is super impressive when the crimes were set basically 60 years ago. So I want to end with a quote by Anne Rule that she wrote about the women who became obsessed with Ted Bundy. And she said, "They were conned by a master con man. They are grieving for a shadow man that never existed." And I think that is why watching Extremely Wicked, Shockingly Evil and Vile is so chilling, because you're basically watching someone perform a ghost. If you watched till the end, thank you so much. Love you so much. Forgot how to do that for a second. It's really late and I'm really tired. Movies coming out. I'm very excited for Camp Miasma. I'm probably like, I can have an intuition when I'm probably going to make a video about something. It's probably going to be that one. Peace and love.